introduce Vanessa Sheridan, our moderator, and then she's going to take it from there. I also wanted to mention that in 2 weeks' time, on November 29th, we have Zachary Drucker coming in for a lecture in photography. Zachary is one of the authors of this work, and she is also a producer of Transgender, the TV show. So what is it called? Transparent. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you. Transparent, the television show. So please join us at 6 o'clock on the 29th as well. But Vanessa Sheridan is here.
Let's hope so.
From the Center on Halstead. She is a transgender and inclusion awareness trainer and a leading national voice for transgender equality and gender authenticity. She is currently the Director of Transgender Relations and Community Engagement for Chicago's Center on Halstead, the third largest LGBT community in the center in the United States. She's also the author of the groundbreaking book, The Complete Guide to Transgender in the Workplace, the first hardcover, full-length volume on this topic ever released by a mainstream publisher. So thank you, Vanessa, for being here tonight. And also, in case I didn't mention this, but if you're not aware, Jess's work is on view at the center right now, and there was an opening last night, so check out that show too. Anyway, Vanessa?
All right. Thank you. It is great to be here with all of you tonight. Thank you all for coming. My goodness, what a wonderful turnout. It's a pleasure to see so many people here for this. I'm very excited. I was contacted a little while ago, well, actually 2 or 3 months ago, and asked if I would moderate this discussion tonight. And I am just thrilled to be here with all of you and with these wonderful panelists who are going to share a lot of information about their work, share some insights about it, and talk about, the way art does what it's supposed to do, which is show us to ourselves in certain ways. And I'm really excited to hear what these folks have to say about that. So with that in mind, I'm simply going to turn the microphone over to Dr. Vanessa Fabre, and we'll see where we go from here. We're also, I'm trying to remind myself and our panelists to use the microphone tonight because this is being recorded and we need to get it onto the video. So that's why we're using microphones. So, Vanessa.
Good evening, everyone. So we're going to each introduce ourselves briefly and tell you about our projects before we launch into some questions. All right. I was trained as a social worker here in Chicago, and I worked at Rush University Medical Center where I ran health and wellness programs for older adults. While I was doing that work, I realized that LGBT older adults were often left out of two important systems, the LGBT network and also the aging network. And so as I was doing that work, I started to realize that this was a population that was being invisibilized. So I did some work with LGBT caregivers, and I was a volunteer psychotherapist at the Center on Halstead. And after that work, I went back for my PhD, and my focus there was specifically on trans perspectives on aging. So that's where I'm coming from when you hear more about the project that Jess and I have worked on. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Big thanks to MOCP and Vanessa for being here. I'm really excited about this panel and very fond of everyone on the panel, so looking forward to that. My name is Jess Dugan. As Karen mentioned, I actually did my MFA here at Columbia College, and I worked at the museum, so it's especially nice to be showing here and participating in this programming. My work is primarily photographic portraiture. I've made work within LGBT communities for about 15 years, and specifically made a lot of work within transgender and gender nonconforming communities, including photographing myself, photographing outward, kind of a broader investigation around identity and gender. So Vanessa, to my right, we have two Vanessas, is also my partner, and we met when I was a graduate student here, and she was doing her PhD. And sort of as a joke, we said, we have a lot of interests. We should really do a project together. And then we kind of let it go, and a couple months later, I was like, no, we should really do a project together. So we started the project that's on display here called To Survive on This Shore. It's a collection of photographs and interviews with people who are transgender and gender nonconforming and over the age of 50. So I really brought the photographic side, and Vanessa brought the aging component, and we launched this project together. So since 2013, we have photographed and interviewed 88 people throughout the United States. We've been very intentional to seek out individuals who are diverse in terms of age. So we have people from 50, our oldest participant is 90, as well as gender identity. We have people who are transmasculine, who are transfeminine, people who are gender nonconforming or don't exist within the binary system. Also in terms of race and ethnicity, geographic location. So we went to small towns as well as big cities. We photographed all over the United States. We did limit it specifically to the United States in part because it's so big of an area to document anyway, that it was already a challenge to cover all of that ground. So we photographed in rural Arkansas, rural South Carolina, as well as obviously New York and LA and places like that. And then we also sought out diversity around socioeconomic class and life narrative. So we have people who transitioned in the 1960s represented in the project, and we have people who transitioned as recently as 2016 in the project. So it really covers a broad group of people. And right now we're working on a book of the work. So we're going to have a book that has about 70 portraits and interviews in it, as well as an exhibition like you can see upstairs that has the photograph and the quote. In addition, we're also partnering with several archives to donate the full interview transcriptions, because if you see upstairs, we only put a short blurb next to each photograph, but we realized at some point that we had captured this huge amount of oral history, in many cases from people who transitioned prior to the internet, prior to the current moment we're in, where there is more trans awareness, and so we really wanted to document that history. So that's all being preserved, and we have 3 different archives on board right now. And then also, we're really hoping to use this project as a springboard for dialogue and education. So we're already starting to partner with nonprofit institutions to use the work in their trainings for people who work with older adults, or for older adults themselves who are in senior centers or other places like that. This is the first physical exhibition of the work, so I'm very excited to have that at the museum. And I was mentioning last night at the Center on Halsted, it's really perfect for me to have this work in the museum space here and also in the Center on Halsted at the same time, because it is so important that it's shown in the community where it was created, and that it's reaching people who may not already be tuned into the museum space, and vice versa here. Hopefully it's raising awareness about people who may be less familiar with the trans community specifically. So I'll pause there and hand it over to Lorenzo, but I'm looking forward to discussion and questions, and thank you all for coming.
Hi, I'm Lorenzo, Triburgo. Yeah, I'm also super excited to be here, and thank you, MLCP, for having us. And it's actually funny, so Jess recently interviewed me for the Strange Fire Collective, and so I've been thinking about this work, but also in the context of sort of overarching issues, ways in which our work converges and diverges, and sort of overarching themes. And something in my practice in general that I've been thinking about for years, again, also making work about the queer community and queer identity for about 15 years also. Really, I think some of the overarching issues that I specifically think photography, why I love photography, is the idea of visibility and the ways in which photography can work to both provide this sense of information, but also the way in which looking is a privilege. And so I think as we're looking and talking today, that's sort of what's going to be in the back of my mind, and this idea of who looks and who is looked upon. And I think for me, I had the experience of someone thinking I was interesting and had a camera pointed at me, and I hated it, and it just it felt like being objectified, right? So for me, I sort of always have this love-hate relationship with photography, and I think that's sort of what keeps me coming back to it. And so we can talk about that a little bit more if that's of interest. Prior to Policing Gender, I had completed a project that I started when I came out as transgender and genderqueer called Trans Portraits. And that is a series of portraits, and it's of other transgender guys that I photographed against landscape oil paintings that I created based on Bob Ross' Joy of Painting instructions, right? And I'm telling you this because I feel like my practice and my ideas are very much situated in the idea of portraiture and what portraits can and cannot do. And again, it's sort of what keeps me going back. It keeps me up at night. For Policing Gender, the project that's here, I had been thinking about for a long time the crisis of mass incarceration in this country and also the criminalization of queerness. I was living in Portland, Oregon at the time, and I was just thinking about, okay, how can I create a project that addresses these issues, that engages with the work that's already being done by activists around these issues. So I connected with some local prison abolitionist organizations, such as Critical Resistance, and at the time there was no specifically queer prison abolition organization in Portland, Oregon, where I was. But knowing people who had worked at the youth health facility, it's called Outside In, it's like a clinic and health facility, knowing for homeless youth, knowing that about 70% or over 70% of the homeless youth identified as queer or trans or non-binary, I know that there's there's this obvious connection between the prison system, mass incarceration, and queer identity. In particular, at the time in Portland, homelessness was also being criminalized, right? So now we have 70% of youth who are homeless identifying as queer, and at the same time, sitting or laying down becomes a crime. So for me, I'm like, okay, A plus B, basically queerness is criminalized. So I was thinking about all these things, connecting with organizations, and I ended up connecting with the national organization Black and Pink that has chapters all over the U.S. They have a really strong, amazing chapter here in Chicago. You should check them out. And got in contact with about 35 LGBTQ identified prisoners in Oregon. And what I learned through Black and Pink, one of the things, was that becoming a pen pal and writing with people who are on the inside does a number of things, but not only are you then becoming maybe an emotional support or a friend or a source of resource for information, but you're also sending a signal to the officers on the inside that, hey, this person has someone on the outside that's looking out for them, so don't mess with them. So many people who are queer and incarcerated don't have anyone on the outside. And so not only does their queer identity make them targets within the system for violence, but then the lack of outside connection leaves them vulnerable for no accountability. So I became a pen pal with, like I said, over 30 people, and just began writing with them on a monthly basis. That, for about a year, was my art practice, and that really is it's the invisible underpinning of policing gender. So we can talk about the aesthetics and the kind of visual decisions as well, but that's sort of what I'll leave you with for now.
Well, as you can see, we've got some really smart, articulate people here. Not only are they artists, but they're very intelligent folks, and I'm really looking forward to getting into some in-depth conversation. And I really would like for us to focus tonight on the concept of themes as they, influence the art of all of these folks. And I want to focus particularly on a couple of themes. One would be vulnerability. Certainly the trans and GNC communities deal with the issue of vulnerability on a number of different levels. And in addition to vulnerability, I would like for us also to think about and talk about and share your insights on the concept of absence and invisibility within these populations as well, because I think your work mirrors that to a certain degree. So I'm just going to turn this over to you folks and let you go with it, and we'll run with that for a few minutes and see what happens, okay? Who would like to start?
Start. Please do. Sure. Yeah, when we were thinking about this panel, those two issues came up a lot, the idea of vulnerability and what does it mean to be vulnerable. And also, one thing we've thought a lot about in our work is this invisibility and visibility. One thing I'll say about the vulnerability piece is, and jump in if you want, we were thinking a lot about how to photograph people who are marginalized or vulnerable in some ways, often struggle with access to healthcare, access to housing, access to jobs, but also being really, really careful to present them with dignity and to also make work that is showing their resilience and strength and the way that people kind of find paths outside of the mainstream. So in portraits and interviews, we were being very conscious to balance those two things. but also wanted to bring attention to some of the very real struggles. Like, for example, I mentioned we were seeking racial diversity, and the average life expectancy for trans women of color is 35. So that's a very different population that we were seeking out than white trans women, and that there are various reasons for that. But we encountered a lot of intersectional identities in the work as well. So maybe I'll pause and let you.
I think for me, coming at the work as a social worker and a social scientist, one worry I have is when we talk about vulnerability with respect to people and populations. I think sometimes over time we start to make vulnerability a characteristic of a person, and we start to see that as something intrinsic to that person, and we lose sight of the social context that constructed the vulnerability in the first place. I see that in the scientific world. We create a variable, we find a way to measure vulnerability, and we attach it to the person, and before long we've forgotten that that was a social force. That wasn't something that necessarily came from being trans or some other social identity. And so that was present in my mind as we especially worked on the quotes, that we presented the social, the environmental, the structural, the political, the economic reasons why people are considered quote-unquote vulnerable. And so my hope was that through the interviews you would see people be able to express for themselves how the world has created this characteristic for them that then is kind of stays with them, either in the social service system or in social sciences, that kind of thing.
It's interesting, actually, the idea of like a criminal, right? It's kind of a similar thing, right? We kind of create this idea, and that becomes someone's identity, and we forget the social situations that create, and also that the idea of crime. I mean, what is criminalized and what is not, right? Like why does someone go to jail for 25 years for having crack, but for 6 months for having coke, right? So thank you, for bringing it back to the social context. I think it's important. In terms of vulnerability, I think that, like I said, for a year I was writing with queer people who were incarcerated, and I kind of we just started writing, and it was just, I told them about, this is who I am, do you want to write? Yes, great, okay, so we just started talking and sharing things about ourselves, but as I'm writing, then I'm thinking about, okay, well, what are the pictures going to be, Lorenzo? Like, what are you going to photograph? And it became apparent to me that the idea of informed consent could not possibly apply. How could I get informed consent? Meaning, knowing that prisoners, in particular queer prisoners, who often get sent to the behavioral health unit. I can get into that a lot. But anyway, knowing that prisoners are often medicated against their will, how can I then say, hey, do you agree to do this project and present your face and come out? It's like, well, I could do that, but how will I know that I'm getting that real informed consent? Additionally, to what end would it serve? As a photographer, we always talk about getting access, right? That's like certain strains of photography. It's like all about getting access. And so I did my due diligence, and I got access to a number of prisons and jails. And I got there and was just like, I am not going to point my camera at these people. And thinking again about queerness and criminality, I think. The reason why I kind of went to the notion of absence was really about trying to separate queerness and criminality. Thinking about, the sort of unintentional formed relationships. If I had a picture of someone, behind bars or in fluorescent lighting, right? Think about the visual connotations. So that to me is really important. But it's also really important that the informed consent, and then also that it's not safe for a lot of queer people in prison to be out. So we were writing a lot and kind of talking around things. We kind of developed ways to share information that would skirt specific issues. So it's, again, knowing that queer people behind bars are targeted specifically, it's not always safe for people to be out. So that was kind of another reason, thinking about the vulnerability and the sort of the way I employ absence specifically because of that.
I also wanted to go back to the idea of visibility and invisibility in our project specifically and within the population that we're working in, after almost every photo shoot and interview, we would leave talking about this idea of what does it mean to be visible or invisible. Many of the people we met with did transition later in life, so there was a large period of time where their authentic selves were not visible to the world, and that created a certain kind of situation where there was sometimes a lot of inner turmoil, but outwardly things were not a struggle. And then when they transitioned, the inverse became true. There was a sense of inner peace and being seen, but in many cases people would lose their relationships or their homes or their jobs, or something externally became a struggle. So it seemed to me like there was always this sort of double-sided dance between those two things. And specifically thinking about photography, with this project, it was really critical that the people who agreed to participate, they knew that their portrait was going to be shown, that we were going to use their real name. I only show first names just as a matter of, giving some people some ounce of not being Googleable. But I do use their first name, their age, their city, and their portrait, and their actual life story. So there was a pretty heavy consent element on the front end. And also conceptually, for me, it was important that people were willing to be seen and be looked at. And I had quite a few people email and want to participate, but for whatever reason, they weren't fully out or they didn't want to show their face. And that was a decision I had to make as to how important that was to the project. And I ultimately decided it was very important, because I think the power is in some ways in people being willing to be seen and show the various aspects of who they are, not overly sugar-coated, not overly otherized, just as factually complex as we could make it.
I'd like to stay with this theme of vulnerability a little bit here, if we can. And you're both, all three of you, are talking about vulnerable populations in one form or another. So what I'd like to ask the panel here is a two-pronged question. One, how are these populations vulnerable? What are some practical examples of how they are vulnerable? And maybe a little deeper, why are they vulnerable? So if you could maybe speak to that, that would be lovely. And by the way, Jess, you just said a buzzword for me. You said their authentic selves. That is a great concept, one that the trans community, I think, is attempting to embody in so many different ways. It's also the focus of the new book I'm working on right now, the concept of gender authenticity and how that impacts people's lives, particularly in the workplace, because that's my focus. But authenticity is a big deal for me and for many trans people in that regard. So I would like for us to continue with the theme of vulnerability, talk about how trans people, are not, well, how these populations that we're talking about are vulnerable, and then why they're vulnerable. So who would like to address that?
I think in terms of trans older adults, I think it's very important to, even though we're foregrounding gender, that we take from the outset an intersectional lens and kind of listing some of the practical challenges that people face. And so for trans older adults, you really can't separate the things that make them vulnerable by gender. Well, there's gender and there's race and there's class and sexuality that come to mind immediately. And so I think one of the most significant concerns is economic vulnerability, lack of protections throughout the life course, and oftentimes there's this connection between, people often feel they have to choose between expressing their authenticity and survival in the world economically. So I think for trans older adults, we're oftentimes helping people cope with economic challenges, and I think in terms of race and ethnicity, which crosses over into how we criminalize certain social identities, how people are perceived, how that authenticity is judged. We deem some people more authentic than others based on these other social identities is very important. I think another critical concern is healthcare. access to health care over the life course, affirming care that can be continued, also that can be continued if they are subject to the criminal justice system, and I think mental health. So I think economic issues, healthcare issues, and I think mental health issues. And again, on that last point, so trans older adults are more likely to experience depression than their LGB counterparts, but I want to keep in mind that that's not necessarily something intrinsic to their trans identity. That's something that reflects the social pressures and the social forces that they're under. So those are the three things that I think about in more practical terms for trans older adults: economics, healthcare, and mental health. Do you want to add to that before we?
I was going to say, just like senior center, fear of care.
Right. One other thing that we've found a lot in our project is in thinking about later life, there are very real fears about participating in senior services and then thinking about long-term care. Most people are a little nervous about assisted living in nursing homes, and imagine if you know for sure that the care providers there are not trained, not prepared to care for you. And so we encountered a lot of people who are very nervous and worried about nursing home care in later life, and we don't yet have a support system to help people find the best places. But we do have people working on that. I see Britta in the corner of the room there. We are working to find safe places for people, but it's a real concern. The care workforce for older adults and aging is not at all prepared to take care of trans people.
Yeah, thank you for, I feel like that just, you're talking about healthcare and aging, but I feel like so much of what Vanessa just said applies to incarceration and people who are in prison. So there's so many, essentially, if you're thinking about the prison industrial complex, right? So thinking about, Vanessa was just describing intersectionality and various cross-sections of what identities that lead to this vulnerability, right? If you're thinking about the prison industrial complex, it's everywhere. And so thinking about, I guess, class and race and gender and sexuality, all of these aspects kind of play into it. So it's like the short answer is why is like, well, sexism, homophobia, racism, classism, right? And so then it's like, well, why that, right? So it's almost like, it's a huge question, to be honest. But thinking about, again, the example of queer youth who are houseless, right? So they're more likely to get arrested. But we also know on top of that people, once you're in prison, your chances of recidivism, right, of being arrested again are something like 10 times higher. So it's actually, once you're in prison, you're actually something like 60% likely to go back, right? So that's the other issue, is that once you're in, your chances of being back there and spending the most of your life there skyrocket, right? So there's that issue. There's the issue of, that police officers, a lot of our criminal punishment system is based on the whims of judgments by a police officer. So one of the things that we hear about a lot is that trans women are arrested for prostitution because police officers wrongfully think that this person is, doing sex work, which should not be illegal anyway, but that's another conversation, right? So there are these sort of direct ways in which this vulnerability happens, and it does have to do with the systems that we have in place. And I won't quote it because I'll botch it, but Angela Davis describes the prison industrial complex as a system of policing, surveillance, and punishment as a way to deal with our social ailments or ills.
Well, and a little bit going off what you were saying, the fear of senior centers reminded me, one thing we were struggling with when making the project was how much to focus on stories of struggle versus how much to focus on stories of resilience. And we tried to strike a balance because we did hear, if you go upstairs, Jay's quote is one of the most painful. It is about abuse in a senior center, abuse of his partner. He actually was, Nursing home, sorry. He was actually diagnosed with breast cancer, but his providers were so so uncomfortable with him as a transgender man that they never gave him his diagnosis. And so he found out a year later that he had been sick, and he has since passed away since we made that portrait. But he's a sort of very clear example of someone who didn't have access to private health insurance, didn't have access to the care that he needed, and it was a very real economic situation that caused him that harm. But I also wanted to talk about how we hear these amazing stories of people making space for other people and caring for other people. I was thinking about, we photographed someone, she's not in the show, but it was in her late 70s in Washington State, and after her spouse passed away, she opened up her home to younger homeless trans women and took them in and built a community for herself at the same time. So we see these places where there is this amazing community coming out of a very difficult situation, and we were trying to show both of those elements in a way that felt respectful.
I was also just thinking about, so kind of touching on why queer criminality or criminalization, but also once people are kind of in the system, LGBTQ people tend to be targeted for higher rates of violence by people who work at the prisons. That queer youth also get longer sentences compared, they get sent to jail as opposed to, sent home, right? They get longer sentences as compared to their non-queer counterparts. And also solitary confinement, which is a huge issue. Queer people are often sent to solitary confinement, administrative segregation for their own safety. And it's really not. It's really just, again, the system kind of whittling down and really coming to someone's whim and judgments, right? So then we have these people who are in solitary confinement. The UN in 2015 said that the maximum amount of time that someone should be allowed to spend in solitary confinement is 15 days. In the US, people spend years, 20 years in solitary confinement, right? And we also know, again, queer people are kind of targeted for that. One of my pen pals, I still write with about 8 people, and with the other people who I was writing with, I connected them with other people, and the project Policing Gender has kind of spread within the prison system, and so I'm always getting new letters for people saying, hey, I heard that you're connecting people with pen pals. I want a pen pal. Sorry, I'm totally down a tangent, but if any of you are interested in becoming a pen pal, it's super awesome. Please talk to me about it. I just distracted myself, but yeah, so solitary confinement is atrocious and is another way in which this, the idea of vulnerability, right? It's but it's this outside force, and Vanessa was saying, it's not this intrinsic thing, I'm vulnerable because I'm trans. No, it's the outside forces.
I'd like to add to that, because of this show and this panel, I was thinking about Lorenzo's work and your use of absence creatively, and I was recently reminded, so I said earlier that the care force in nursing homes is not at all trained to take care of trans people. However, trans people and LGBT aging advocates have been creative about using what was really an invisibility. So I just recently was reminded that in the late 80s, when legislation was passed to protect nursing home residents, and many of you may be familiar with the Nursing Home Bill of Rights. You have rights universally by law in this country if you live in a nursing home. Things like 24/7 access to visitors. They can't say there's only a certain visitor time because this is your home. So there's a Bill of Rights for nursing homes. And luckily, because LGBT people were so invisible, the protections and the legislation doesn't mark out any group to be excluded from that Bill of Rights. And so recently, advocates have creatively turned that invisibility on its head, and are now using that legislation to file complaints with CMS, Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, to file claims when trans people are not protected in nursing homes. So I've been inspired by that creative use of invisibility to argue that actually Congress in 1987 technically voted to protect trans people in nursing homes. And we're using that now as a way to make some real gains in that area.
I'm going to jump back briefly to the authenticity topic. When we started this project, I was actually a little worried that the focus was so narrow that it might not be of a broader interest. I was like, God, I'm already getting pegged as this trans photographer. Now I'm going to go even more niche. But what's been really amazing is one of the themes that has emerged is the struggle to live as your authentic self, often against societal pressure or expectations from other people. And what's been really amazing for me is that link provides an entrance point for everyone, because I think this is, trans people face this in a specific way, but I think most people can relate to this path of trying to live authentically and trying to be seen as yourself. And so for people who know nothing about the trans community, the age element has actually been a really broad entrance point. And then the other thing about visibility is that, again, when we were starting this project, I'd heard several younger trans people say, well, I've never seen an older trans person. I don't know what my life will look like as I get older. Like, I've never seen an older trans man. And so we realized there was also a lack of imagery for the community itself. And so we wanted to create this kind of example of all these different people living their lives in different ways. And it's funny, people will often say to me, how did you even find enough people? And I'm like, I have like 300 people on my Excel list that I'm keeping track of, and then there's like thousands more that I could find. It's just fascinating that people don't have a real framework to think about what trans older adults look like, and if they think of something, it's perhaps not it's not the reality.
I hope you're finding this to be as rich as I am. This is fascinating stuff, and I'm so glad that you're all here to listen to it. I'd like to shift our emphasis a little bit here, and my feeling is that all three of you will really be able to talk to this, but I'd like for us to have a little discussion, if you will, about how art, the art that you create, the art that you're engaged in, can be used for two purposes. One, for education, which you just talked about a little bit, and secondly, for activism, to help move the community forward and to make progress in that regard. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that and see where we might be able to go with this, because art is such a powerful medium, and it can be used for a variety of different purposes, but I'd like for us to focus on education and activism if we can do that. So who would like to begin on that?
What exactly is the question, though?
There is no question.
Like how?
The use of art as a medium for education and activism.
Okay. Art is used for education and activism. No, I'm just. So I don't know. It's really hard for me to kind of separate out. When I'm thinking about projects in general, I'm always thinking about where are they going to go and how can they function, right? But my brain sort of starts to go into like, well, what is it going to look like, and how does what it looks like and sound like then communicate? So for me, it comes back to like this way of communicating, and how like I get kind of interested in the way that what is a black and white image? When someone looks at a black and white image, what is that sort of connote to them versus if it looks like a color image, right? So sort of the very specific ways that photography works is sort of first of all for me. But yeah, I mean, with policing gender, every time I talk about it, I have, just promised myself that I would host workshops, talk about being a pen pal, get new pen pals, which all of you, I mean, I will make time to talk to all of you about becoming a pen pal after this. So, and so for me, it's really about using this project as a launch pad to have these conversations in spaces like this. So I think that's the activism, that's the education, and I think education is also, an activist practice. I am also an educator. I teach at Oregon State University, right? And I'm always thinking about the ways that I can bring social justice, not only issues, but also the way that I teach. How can we communicate in ways that are, bucking the system? I don't know. I'm wanting to curse right now, but I'm not. But how can we push against the system with kind of everything we've got? And if I want to push against the system and I'm an artist, then that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, I think similar to some things Lorenzo said, I very much view my work as a starting point for a larger dialogue. And I always say I have one foot in the art world and one foot in the activism LGBT world, and I try to do both things at all times. So, I mean, I think one tangible example actually is having the show up at the center right now and having a different conversation around that. One thing we've experienced is a lot of LGBT groups and nonprofit groups are already coming to us to use these images in trainings because there's such a lack of images that they can pull from. So we're starting to partner with various groups around the country, and they're using our materials for various purposes that will hopefully go, we'll educate providers, we'll educate people that work directly with trans older adults. Do you want to talk about the question coming off the census and how our pictures were sent in?
Right. Some of you in the audience know about this, but with the new administration, there have been attacks on multiple levels, and one of these attacks they tried to do sneakily in the night online. The Centers for Community Living, they have a survey of all people who use senior services that are federally funded. So this is money that goes to every state for senior services, Meals on Wheels, those kinds of programs. So people worked very hard to get to the point where in 2014 we finally included questions about sexual orientation on this survey, and sexual orientation and gender identity. And all of a sudden, Centers for Community Living took the question off. They just put the re-up of the survey, and activists noted who are working in aging, and launched a massive campaign, and we all sent postcards in. This was led by SAGE, Services and Advocacy for GLBT Elders, and we inundated this federal agency with postcards with images, some of which came from our project, images and stories and our names and what we do and why we're concerned about trans older adults and LGBT older adults. And the agency, they haven't been able to replace everyone at every federal agency. The agency responded and put the questions back in. And so it was a very satisfying, it was a scary moment because data is important, and being left out of those surveys completely invisibilizes people. So if you have no idea how many trans or LGBT older adults are using Meals on Wheels, it's very easy to continue to cut funding or not include them. So we were happy that some of our images, I think, was it a group in San Francisco, the Open House in San Francisco took some of our images from the project, and they sent a giant postcard with images to the center as their particular appeal. So that was a good example of how imagery and art was used for a real tangible result.
Yeah, and I think also more broadly for me, I believe that representation is really important, and when you are part of a community that you don't see yourself represented in the mainstream, I think art can fill that gap and create representations that people can see. And I know for me, when I was young and I was coming out as a young queer gender nonconforming person, I found comfort in work by Catherine Opie and Robert Mapplethorpe to a slightly less direct extent, and Della Grace Volcano. I mean, the first place I felt really validated was in photography books. And so I think that kind of representation is really critical. And luckily now we have a lot more mainstream talking about transparent and a whole variety of other things where people do see themselves represented more. But I think simply creating these images sometimes can be its own kind of activism and can be very meaningful.
I have one more question for our panel, and then I think I'd like to open it up to questions and comments from all of you. But the last question I have is a more broad-based question. I am the last person in the world who would ever call myself a visual artist. I have talent, but it's not in the visual arts, okay? And my guess is that I'm not alone in that. And so I would ask all of you, how can we, and I'm using the royal we here, all of us, how can we be supportive of the work that you do and the work that other visual artists do to help make a bigger difference, to help make more of an impact, and to help move things forward on behalf of the larger LGBTQ community. So how can we be supportive, I guess, is the question.
Well, I think that's a giant question, and we could tackle it from like a practical side or a sort of personal education side. But I think, one thing that I hope this kind of a project accomplishes is that people who may never have met a transgender person or a transgender older adult just take time and look at the photographs and read the stories and create their own awareness and educate themselves. So on a very personal level, I think that's something people can do is read and look and become more familiar. Then I think there's a whole host of larger things that institutions can do, but that might be kind of a rabbit hole. So I think I'll pass it off and see what these two think.
Passing to you.
Oh, thanks. So you should buy lots of art, right? I mean, that's like, no, but coming out to events like this is like the perfect thing, right? Because, I mean, honestly, it's nice. It's nice to feel like, oh, I'm doing this work that other people want to talk about and that I'm not, if a tree falls in the forest, right? Like, So I'm making a sound. Thank you for being here. I mean, really, that's really, I think, it on every level. I'd love to go back to representation too, though, if that's okay with you, Vanessa S. But because I was just reminded of when you were talking about Catherine Opie and Mapplethorpe, whatever. But so I don't know how many of you are familiar with Versailles, right? The Paris at night, and the idea of representation, I think, is also something that I really not struggle with, but I think about a lot. And part of creating, like with my previous work, Trans Portraits, and creating positive representations, like what you were just talking about. And then, in getting feedback, that is one way that people can support. But I don't know, but thinking about the politics of representation, I think that for me, I also just didn't want to leave here tonight without sort of talking about my impetus to sort of challenge photography as this tool for voyeurism. And I think that part of what I wanted to do with this project was like challenge you all and say, and I think you're up to the task to say, hey, look at this project. These are about people. There's no people in them. But walk with me here, and photography can work in so many other ways. And so I just wanted to, I was thinking back to the first images that I saw of other queer people, particularly from the 1930s, but also thinking about the ways in which photographers, not Jess, but which photographers can sometimes shove their camera in someone's face, right? And I wanted to take a risk and not do that and really create work that challenged that. So that's what I've got.
You want to respond to that?
Well, no, I was going to bounce back. Did you want to say something?
I wanted to add one thing.
Yeah.
I thought I would add a perspective, since I'm not an artist, but I think a little bit based on what Jess was saying about what you can do personally. And I think as a non-trans identified person, maybe gender non-conforming depending on the day, I think I wanted to build off Jess's idea about taking in the stories and doing your own work. So I'm speaking, I think, a little more to the folks who are not trans identified. I think it's important to move beyond the idea of giving voice to other people. Everyone has a voice. We need to be better listeners. And I would encourage those of you who are taking in these stories and wanting to be better educated and aware about trans issues to move beyond thinking that you're giving voice to someone else and really look critically at your own voice and your own thoughts and other ways that you can integrate these stories into who you are, how you move through the world, how you're willing to look critically at your own assumptions and behaviors and actions and where you spend your time, because I think at that personal level that's incredibly meaningful. So I just wanted to extend that, taking in the stories but then looking critically at yourself. What does that mean for your own change? How can you be a different person based on that awareness and education?
Sort of tag teaming off that, actually. I think sometimes these issues, homophobia, transphobia, poverty, racism, they feel so insurmountable, but I think if each person looks around in their sphere of what they can influence and has control over, and is thoughtful about that, it can really go a long way. If you're in a position to hire somebody, hire a trans person, hire a person of color. If you're in a position to curate a show, include trans people and people of color and women. Really look about what is your circle of influence and use that as much as you can. And I think these things feel little, but sometimes they go a really long way and they can be really significant.
Vanessa just mentioned something about using your own voice, and this is where I want to invite you to do that. If you have any questions or comments that you would like to ask our panel, let's begin doing that. Yes, sir.
So one of the things
Let me hand you the mic, okay, so we can record this.
court stretches up far, good to go. One of the things that I think is important about this exhibition is the range of strategies deployed in the making of the work. Some of the work is very discursive. Some of the work operates at the level of visual poetics and kind of everything in between. And I think it's important to state because very often work that is produced by what some people would consider, by what the mainstream might consider socially marginalized communities, tends to be ghettoized as a practice that is informed only by its social marginality, when in fact all of the works in this exhibition are also for their specificity in terms of the experiences that they're coming out of, engage with a larger conversation within the field, and they should be seen and spoken of as such, and not just ghettoized or essentialized, because I think it is something that it's a device that often happens to, in some ways, devalue the work and keep it separate from a larger conversation. And so I think that's one of the things that's important about this exhibition, is the range of strategies that are deployed by the artists, much the way one might find in any other large group exhibition in a museum. So there's that aspect of the specificity of the experiences that have generated the work. But at the same time, the work holds its own as part of a larger conversation. And I think that respect needs to be underscored, because very often with marginalized communities, it's a point at which the work becomes segregated, and kind of shunted off to the side until, yes, we need some more marginalized community work, whether it's Black or whether it's LGBT or whether it's trans. It always is part of a larger conversation, even as it is generated by a very specific set of concerns. And I think it's just important to underscore that.
Thank you. Would any of you like to respond to what this gentleman just said? Okay. Any other questions or comments for our panel? Yes.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you very much. I feel that this work is really important to me because it's a step in questioning the social constructs of our society, which is patriarchal. And trans people and non-binding gender, whatever you want to call it, is finally getting to the root of the problem, believe it or not. For me, vulnerability began at a very early age, and that theme runs in all of the photographs and the stories that are told. I knew at a very early age that I was an alien. I did not fit into a social engineered construct. And at that point, when you step from behind that drape, because spiritually that's what's happening, you become vulnerable from that point on. And you live your life trying to balance not being vulnerable. And if you manage that, then you get to be 67 like me and a badass and the strongest person that I know today, because there's no reason I should be here, because I've made it twice over 35. So I think it's really important work. And to answer your question, what can we do? I don't like to be a Tuesday friend. I don't like to be invited to cocktail parties because I'm trans. I like to be invited to family Thanksgiving dinner because I'm a human being first. And that's important to me. So I think if you learn, you come to an exhibition about this, your thought patterns change, and as a result of your thought patterns change, then your actions should start to change. Then you start to gain wisdom. And then you start to know something about yourself. And then you find out you've been deceived. Because we really do exist. And it's really very simple like that, So it's that vulnerability that I've had to live with that has made me very strong. Now when I get down to the application and it says other, I put alien. It's very simple. I just put alien. And someone said, what does that mean? I said, well, I haven't decided which planet I really came from, because I'm not adhering to the engineered racism, whatever. I identify as two-spirit, and that's it. I have a Creole mother, a French dad, I'm Native American blood. So spiritually, I identify as a two-spirited person, and that's just the bottom line. I'm going to be who I'm going to be. So if you spend your life planting tomatoes, then you're going to pick tomatoes, like the Duchess says. So think about what you're planting in your life. Are you always going to the same neighborhood? Are you always seeing the same people? Because if you are, then you're not growing.
That's one alien to another. Thank you.
I also just want to note that Helena is in our project, and that's one of our amazing subjects who has shared her story with us. Her photograph's up at the Center on Halsted right now, so thank you so much for weighing in.
Yes. Let me give you the mic here. Whoa, if I don't kill myself first.
I'm curious what you think about the title of the show, Disruptive Perspectives.
Who wants to be disruptive?
I find it actually appropriate, particularly because of the various approaches to the subject matter. So there's this umbrella, we're all coming from this specific point of, there's a queerness, right? But for me, I think as an artist, on the artist side of my brain or whatever, I feel like thinking about institutional critiques and the ways in which I can use art to be a critique of the ways of seeing. Does that make sense? Okay, so for me that's really important, and I think that it was exciting for me to think about disruptive perspectives as a title, not as, because these people are queer, they're disrupting something, but it's because we're using photography in all of these different ways. It's like disrupting the medium to me is also really important and interesting.
I think my thoughts about the title are the same that I feel about the show, which is really what Dawood said, that I feel like the exhibition has a rigor to it that goes beyond one identity, and the work really comes from different perspectives. And it is, I think about it in terms of disrupting kind of mainstream assumptions and status quo and comfort to draw attention to issues that are very significant. But yeah, I think for me the title that plays into this idea of the work being diverse in a bunch of different ways and leading you to a discussion and a thought. But, sometimes especially LGBT shows can be so, the only common denominator is that somebody's gay. And it's like, that's not very interesting to me as an artist to participate in. So I'm really grateful to be part of a show that really goes to a much deeper level than that.
I was thinking about something today. We're not here tonight to necessarily be comfortable. We're here to grow. And growing is not always comfortable. Sometimes it's messy. It's difficult. It's complex. And sometimes it's downright uncomfortable. But that's okay, because that's going to help move us forward and help us change and help us become better people and hopefully help us evolve. My hope is that tonight we've all had the opportunity to do something of that. And I am so grateful to our panel for their insights and their wisdom and the artistry that they have shared with all of us. And if you wouldn't mind, I would appreciate it if you would give them a nice round of applause.